Imagine a world reeling from the devastation of World War II, a fragile peace settling over a landscape scarred by unimaginable conflict. The victorious Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain and France, stood united in their triumph over Nazi Germany. Yet, beneath the surface of this alliance, lay deep ideological divisions and long-held suspicions that would soon erupt into a new kind of global struggle, the Cold War. Even before the final shots of World War II were fired, cracks began to appear in the Grand Alliance. The differing visions for the post-war world, particularly concerning the future of Eastern Europe, sowed seeds of mistrust between the capitalist West and the communist East. The Soviet Union, determined to create a buffer zone against future threats, began establishing communist-leaning regimes in the nations it had liberated from Nazi occupation. Imagine Winston Churchill, in his famous 1946 speech, coining the phrase "Iron Curtain" to describe the ideological and physical division that was descending across Europe, separating the Soviet sphere of influence from the West. This wasn't a traditional border with armies massed for invasion, but a metaphorical wall of suspicion, secrecy, and differing political systems that would shape global politics for decades to come. The immediate post-war years saw a series of escalating tensions. Imagine the pressure on countries like Greece and Turkey, caught between the competing interests of the superpowers. The United States, under the Truman Doctrine, pledged to support nations resisting communist influence, marking a clear departure from its pre-war isolationist policies and signaling a commitment to containing Soviet expansion. The fate of Germany, and particularly its capital Berlin, became an early and dangerous flashpoint. Imagine the city, divided into sectors controlled by the Allied powers, lying deep within the Soviet zone. When the Soviets blockaded West Berlin in 1948, cutting off all land and water routes for supplies, the world held its breath. This wasn't a direct military confrontation, but a high-stakes political gamble that threatened to escalate into armed conflict. The Western Allies responded with the remarkable Berlin airlift. Imagine American and British planes, day after day, flying essential supplies into West Berlin, defying the Soviet blockade and demonstrating their resolve. This sustained effort, a logistical masterpiece, ultimately forced the Soviets to lift the blockade, but the underlying tensions remained, a stark reminder of the potential for direct confrontation. The development of nuclear weapons by both the United States and the Soviet Union added a terrifying new dimension to the Cold War. Imagine the dawning realization that a future conflict between these superpowers could lead to global annihilation. This fear, while preventing direct large-scale war, also fueled an arms race and a constant state of anxiety, with the world teetering on the brink of nuclear catastrophe during moments of heightened tension. The early flashpoints of the Cold War, from the ideological divide symbolized by the Iron Curtain to the direct confrontation over Berlin, laid the groundwork for decades of global tension and near miss. These moments, often overshadowed by later crises, were crucial in shaping the dynamics of the Cold War and highlighting the ever-present danger of a conflict that could engulf the world. Imagine the Korean Peninsula, once a unified nation, now divided along the 38th parallel after World War II, with a communist regime in the north, supported by the Soviet Union, and a pro-Western government in the south, backed by the United States. This division became a tinderbox, and in 1950, it erupted into a full-scale war that brought the world dangerously close to a wider conflict. The invasion of South Korea by North Korean forces in June 1950 took the world by surprise. Imagine the rapid advance of the North Korean army, overwhelming the unprepared South Korean defenses. The United States, fearing the spread of communism in Asia, spearheaded a United Nations response, sending troops, primarily American, to defend South Korea. Imagine American soldiers, many of whom had fought in World War II, now facing a new enemy in a distant and unfamiliar land. The early months of the war were a desperate retreat for the UN forces, pushed back to a small perimeter around the port city of Pusan. The intervention of General Douglas MacArthur and the daring amphibious landing at Incheon dramatically reversed the tide of the war, pushing the North Korean forces back across the 38th parallel and even towards the Yalu River, the border with China. This advance, however, triggered a crucial escalation. Imagine China, fearing a hostile American presence on its border, entering the war in force. The sheer number of Chinese volunteer troops pushed the UN forces into a long and bloody stalemate, characterized by brutal fighting in the harsh Korean terrain. The Korean War became a proxy conflict, a hot war fought within the larger context of the Cold War. Imagine the United States and the Soviet Union backing opposing sides with weapons, supplies, and advisors, but carefully avoiding direct military confrontation with each other. The fear of escalating the conflict into a Third World War, potentially involving nuclear weapons, loomed large. The war dragged on for 3 long years, marked by devastating battles and immense casualties on both sides. Imagine the frozen battlefields of the Chosin Reservoir, the relentless artillery barrages, and the human cost of a war fought to a stalemate. The conflict highlighted the dangers of ideological division and the potential for local conflicts to become entangled in the global power struggle of the Cold War. The armistice signed in 1953 brought an end to the fighting, but did not resolve the underlying tensions. Imagine the Korean Peninsula remaining divided to this day, a heavily militarized border separating 2 hostile nations, a stark reminder of the unresolved conflicts of the Cold War era. The Korean War was a critical flashpoint, a moment when the Cold War threatened to turn into a direct confrontation between the superpowers. The restraint shown by both sides, driven by the fear of nuclear war, ultimately prevented a wider conflict, but the Korean Peninsula remained a volatile region, a symbol of the enduring divisions of the Cold War. Imagine the world in October 1962, gripped by an unprecedented level of fear and anxiety. The United States and the Soviet Union, locked in their nuclear standoff, found themselves in a direct and terrifying confrontation over the small island nation of Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days that brought humanity closer to nuclear annihilation than ever before. The crisis began with the discovery by American intelligence of Soviet medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles being secretly deployed in Cuba. Imagine the shock and alarm in the White House as aerial photographs revealed the construction of missile launch sites capable of striking major American cities within minutes. For President John Kennedy and his advisors, this Soviet move was an unacceptable escalation, a direct threat to American security. Kennedy responded with a naval blockade of Cuba, a quarantine aimed at preventing further Soviet missile shipment. Imagine American warships surrounding the island, confronting Soviet vessels steaming across the Atlantic. The tension was palpable. Any miscalculation or act of aggression could have triggered a direct military clash between the 2 superpowers. Behind the scenes, a tense diplomatic standoff unfolded. Imagine the secret back-channel communications between the White House and the Kremlin, with both sides trying to find a way to de-escalate the crisis without losing face. The world watched and waited, fearing the worst as the 2 leaders engaged in a high-stakes game of nuclear brinkmanship. The pressure mounted with each passing day. Imagine the debates within the Kennedy administration, with some advocating for an immediate military strike against the missile sites, a move that could have provoked a Soviet response and potentially led to nuclear war. Kennedy, however, opted for a more cautious approach, combining the blockade with diplomatic pressure. The Vietnam War stands as a stark example of how the ideological struggle of the Cold War could lead to prolonged and devastating regional conflicts, drawing in the superpowers without resulting in direct confrontation, but with immense human cost and lasting political consequences. It remains a powerful reminder of the complexities and dangers of proxy wars in a world divided by competing ideologies. Imagine the rugged mountains and tribal regions of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union, concerned about the stability of the communist government in Kabul and the potential spread of Islamic fundamentalism, made a fateful decision to intervene militarily. This invasion, intended to be a swift operation, turned into a decade-long quagmire that many have likened to the Soviet Union's Vietnam. The Soviet Union's deployment of troops was met with fierce resistance from the Afghan Mujahideen, a diverse group of rebels supported by various international actors, most notably the United States. Imagine the CIA, in a covert operation known as Operation Cyclone, channeling significant financial and military aid, including Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, to the Afghan resistance fighters. The conflict in Afghanistan became another major proxy war of the Cold War. Imagine the Soviet Union pouring resources into propping up the Afghan communist regime, while the United States and its allies funneled support to the Mujahideen. This indirect confrontation played out on Afghan soil, with the Afghan people caught in the middle of a devastating conflict. The Soviet military, accustomed to conventional warfare, found itself bogged down in a protracted guerrilla war against highly motivated and well-armed Mujahideen fighters who knew the mountainous terrain intimately. Imagine Soviet tanks and armored vehicles struggling in the narrow passes, vulnerable to ambushes by rebels armed with Western-supplied weaponry. The war had a significant impact on the Soviet Union itself. Imagine the growing disillusionment at home as the casualties mounted and the conflict dragged on with no clear end in sight. The financial strain of the war also exacerbated the Soviet Union's already struggling economy. This bleeding wound, as it became known, contributed to the internal pressures that would eventually lead to the collapse of the Soviet Empire. For the United States, supporting the Afghan resistance was seen as a way to bleed the Soviet Union and counter its influence. Imagine the strategic calculations in Washington, viewing Afghanistan as an opportunity to weaken their Cold War adversary. However, the long-term consequences of supporting the Mujahideen, including the rise of radical Islamic groups, would have unforeseen and far-reaching implications in the decades to come. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan became a major flashpoint in the late Cold War, further escalating tensions between the superpowers. It demonstrated the dangers of interventionism and the potential for proxy conflicts to have unintended and destabilizing consequences. The bear trap of Afghanistan proved to be a costly and ultimately unsustainable venture for the Soviet Union, contributing significantly to the unraveling of the Eastern Bloc. Imagine the world living under the shadow of nuclear annihilation for decades. The United States' development and use of atomic weapons in World War II ushered in a new era of global threat, and the Soviet Union's rapid acquisition of nuclear capabilities initiated a dangerous and unprecedented arms race. This balance of terror, as it was often called, became a defining characteristic of the Cold War. The logic was grim: mutual assured destruction. Imagine both superpowers possessing enough nuclear weapons to obliterate each other and much of the world. The very destructiveness of these arsenals was intended to prevent their use, as any first strike would inevitably lead to a devastating retaliatory attack. This created a precarious stability, a world held hostage by the threat of its own destruction. Imagine the relentless buildup of nuclear arsenals on both sides. Each superpower sought to achieve strategic superiority, leading to a quantitative and qualitative arms race. New and more powerful weapons were developed, from hydrogen bombs to intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, capable of striking targets across the globe in minutes. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, added another layer of complexity and survivability to each side's nuclear forces. The constant fear of a preemptive strike led to a state of perpetual alert. Imagine military personnel on both sides standing ready to launch nuclear weapons at a moment's notice. Early warning systems were developed to detect incoming missiles, but the risk of false alarms and miscalculations was ever present, any of which could have had catastrophic consequences. Numerous close calls and moments of heightened tension brought the world to the brink. Imagine radar glitches that appeared to show incoming attacks, or misunderstandings during military exercises that could have been interpreted as hostile actions. These incidents underscored the fragility of the nuclear peace and the ever-present danger of accidental war. The arms race extended beyond the sheer number and power of weapons. Imagine the development of complex strategic doctrines, outlining the conditions under which nuclear weapons might be used. The concepts of first strike, second strike, and limited nuclear war were debated and refined, adding layers of terrifying complexity to the nuclear standoff. Efforts to control the arms race were also undertaken. Imagine the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, and other arms control treaties aimed at limiting the production and deployment of certain types of nuclear weapons. These negotiations were often fraught with mistrust and political maneuvering, but they represented an attempt to manage the existential threat posed by the nuclear arsenals. The nuclear arms race permeated the culture of the Cold War. Imagine films, literature, and public discourse reflecting the anxieties and fears of nuclear war. Duck and cover drills in schools became a surreal symbol of a world living under the atomic shadow. The balance of terror was a terrifying gamble, a situation where the survival of humanity rested on the assumption of rational actors and the flawless operation of complex technological systems. It was a constant source of anxiety and a stark reminder of the stakes of the Cold War rivalry. Imagine the city of Berlin, once the heart of a unified Germany, now a fractured metropolis at the very epicenter of the Cold War. Following World War II, Berlin was divided into sectors controlled by the Allied powers, even though it lay entirely within Soviet-controlled East Germany. This precarious situation culminated in the dramatic construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, a physical embodiment of the Iron Curtain and a stark symbol of ideological division. Imagine the suddenness of its erection. In the dead of night, East German soldiers began constructing a barbed wire fence, which quickly evolved into a concrete wall, snaking its way through the city. This barrier separated families, friends, and entire communities, cutting off East Berliners from the West and preventing the flow of people between the two halves of the city. The Berlin Wall became a potent symbol of the ideological chasm that separated the communist East from the capitalist West. Imagine the stark contrast between the vibrant, consumer-driven West Berlin, a showcase of Western prosperity, and the more austere, controlled environment of East Berlin. The wall was a physical manifestation of these opposing systems. For those living in its shadow, the Berlin Wall was a constant reminder of lost freedoms and divided lives. Imagine families shouting across the barrier, unable to touch or embrace. Imagine the desperation of those who attempted to escape East Berlin, often at great personal risk, and the tragic stories of those who were caught or killed trying to cross the heavily guarded death strip. The wall became a focal point for Cold War tensions and rhetoric. Imagine American presidents standing at the Brandenburg Gate, demanding its dismantling. John F. Kennedy's powerful words, "Ich bin ein Berliner," resonated around the world, expressing solidarity with the people of West Berlin and defiance against communist oppression. The Berlin Wall also served as a stark illustration of the differing values and priorities of the two superpowers. The West championed individual liberty and freedom of movement, while the East prioritized state control and ideological purity. The wall stood as a concrete testament to this fundamental disagreement. Despite the dangers, the spirit of resistance and the desire for reunification persisted. Imagine the creative and often daring attempts to cross the wall, from digging tunnels to constructing makeshift hot air balloons. These acts of defiance, though often unsuccessful, symbolized the yearning for freedom and unity. For decades, the Berlin Wall remained a seemingly insurmountable barrier, a physical scar across a city and a continent. It represented the seemingly permanent division of the world into two hostile camps. Its eventual fall in 1989, a moment of profound historical significance, became a powerful symbol of the crumbling of the Eastern Bloc and the end of the Cold War's rigid division. The Berlin Wall serves as a powerful historical artifact, a reminder of a time when the world teetered on the brink of conflict due to ideological differences. Its story underscores the late 1950s and 1960s, a period of intense competition between the United States and the Soviet Union that extended beyond military might and ideological influence into the uncharted territory of space. The space race became a highly visible and symbolic battleground of the Cold War, each superpower striving to demonstrate its technological superiority and the supposed triumph of its political system. The Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik in 1957 sent shockwaves around the world, particularly in the United States. Imagine the American public's surprise and concern as the Soviets achieved the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. This technological leap was seen not only as a scientific achievement, but also as a potential military advantage, suggesting Soviet prowess in rocketry that could be applied to missile technology. The United States responded with a renewed focus on its own space program, creating NASA and pouring vast resources into catching up with and surpassing the Soviets. Imagine the intense pressure on American scientists and engineers to achieve their own space milestone. The space race became a series of dramatic firsts. Imagine the Soviet Union achieving the first animal in orbit, Laika the dog, the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin, and the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. Each Soviet success was met with intense American efforts to equal or surpass it, fueling a cycle of competition and innovation. The United States achieved its own significant milestones, including the first American in orbit, John Glenn, and the ambitious Apollo program, culminating in the ultimate prize of the space race, landing the first humans on the moon. Imagine the global spectacle of Neil Armstrong's one small step, a moment broadcast around the world and seen as a major victory for American technology and ideology. The space race was not solely about national prestige and technological demonstration. Imagine the military applications of space technology, including reconnaissance satellites for spying on the enemy, and the potential for space-based weapon systems. The competition in space had a clear strategic dimension. Beyond the headline-grabbing achievements, the space race spurred significant advancements in science and technology that had lasting benefits for humanity. Imagine the development of new materials, electronics, and communication systems driven by the demands of space exploration. These innovations found their way into everyday life, from Teflon coatings to satellite television. The space race also captured the imagination of people around the world, inspiring generations of scientists, engineers, and dreamers. Imagine the sense of wonder and possibility that the exploration of space engendered, even amidst the tensions of the Cold War. While the intense rivalry eventually cooled with the end of the Cold War and a shift towards international cooperation in space exploration, the space race remains a powerful example of how the ideological competition between the superpowers played out on a grand and technologically ambitious stage. It was a battle for hearts and minds, as much as for scientific supremacy, with each side seeking to prove the superiority of its system by reaching for the stars. Imagine the late 1980s, a period of increasing internal pressure and reform within the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellite states. Under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, economic restructuring, began to loosen the tight grip of communist control. This shift created a ripple effect across the Eastern Bloc, including East Germany. For decades, the Berlin Wall had stood as an seemingly impenetrable barrier, a symbol of oppression and division, but the winds of change were blowing. Imagine the growing discontent among East Germans, fueled by economic stagnation and a desire for greater freedom. Many looked to the reforms in the Soviet Union and the increasing openness in neighboring countries like Hungary, which had begun to dismantle its border fences with Austria. The summer of 1989 saw a surge in East Germans attempting to emigrate to the West. Imagine them traveling to Hungary, hoping to cross the newly opened border into Austria and then on to West Germany. This exodus put increasing pressure on the East German government. Mass protests began to erupt in East German cities. Imagine thousands of people taking to the streets, chanting slogans for freedom and demanding the right to travel. The government, facing mounting public pressure and a changing political landscape in the Soviet Union, began to falter. The pivotal moment arrived on November 9. Imagine the confusion and uncertainty at a press conference when a high-ranking East German official, Günter Schabowski, prematurely announced new travel regulations that appeared to open the border with immediate effect. The news spread like wildfire. Imagine East Berliners, incredulous and overjoyed, flocking to the Berlin Wall. Border guards, caught completely off guard and without clear instructions, initially tried to hold back the crowds, but overwhelmed by the sheer number of people, they eventually yielded and opened the gates. The scenes that followed were electrifying. Imagine East and West Berliners embracing, celebrating, and even beginning to tear down sections of the wall that had divided their city and their lives for nearly 3 decades. This spontaneous outpouring of joy and unity was broadcast around the world, a powerful symbol of hope and the crumbling of the Iron Curtain. The fall of the Berlin Wall had profound political consequences. Imagine the domino effect it had across Eastern Europe, emboldening pro-democracy movements and leading to the rapid collapse of communist regimes in one country after another. The symbolic dismantling of the wall signaled the beginning of the end of the Cold War's rigid divisions and the reunification of Germany. While the formal end of the Cold War still lay a couple of years in the future, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall was a watershed moment. It represented a tangible victory for the forces of freedom and democracy, and a significant crack in the seemingly insurmountable Iron Curtain that had divided the world for so long. The images of people dancing on top of the wall, tearing it down with hammers and pickaxes, became iconic symbols of the end of an era, a moment when the seemingly impossible became reality, driven by the will of the people and the changing tides of history. Imagine the early 1990s, a period of rapid and transformative change on the global stage. The cracks in the Iron Curtain, symbolized by the fall of the Berlin Wall, widened into gaping holes as the Soviet Union, the other superpower in the Cold War rivalry, began to unravel from within. This internal collapse, while not a traditional flashpoint of direct military confrontation between the US and USSR, was the ultimate culmination of decades of tension and near misses, finally bringing the Cold War era to a definitive end. The seeds of the Soviet Union's dissolution had been sown over many years. Imagine the inherent contradictions of a centralized, authoritarian system struggling to compete economically and ideologically with the West's. The costly and protracted war in Afghanistan had exposed the limits of Soviet power and drained its resources. The Chernobyl disaster in 1986 revealed the system's inefficiencies and lack of transparency. Gorbachev's reforms of glasnost and perestroika, while intended to revitalize the Soviet Union, inadvertently unleashed forces that ultimately led to its demise. Imagine the newfound freedoms of expression and political participation, empowering nationalist movements within the various Soviet republics. Long suppressed desires for self-determination began to surface with increasing force. The economic restructuring of perestroika proved difficult to implement effectively, leading to shortages, inflation, and widespread discontent. Imagine the frustration of Soviet citizens who had long endured economic hardship, now facing further instability and uncertainty. The revolutions in Eastern Europe in 1989, often peaceful but marking the end of communist rule in those nations, further weakened the Soviet Union's grip on its sphere of influence. Imagine the domino effect, as one satellite state, after another, embraced democracy and independence, leaving the Soviet Union increasingly isolated. The Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia led the way in declaring their independence in 1990, emboldening similar movements in other republics. Imagine the growing momentum for self-determination across the Soviet Union, from Ukraine to Georgia to Kazakhstan. A pivotal moment occurred in August 1991, when hardline elements within the Soviet government launched a failed coup attempt to oust Gorbachev and halt the reforms. Imagine the world holding its breath once again, fearing a return to Cold War confrontation. However, the coup ultimately failed due to popular resistance and the actions of leaders like Boris Yeltsin in Russia. The failed coup accelerated the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Imagine one republic after another declaring its independence in the following months. By December 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved, replaced by a commonwealth of independent states. The red flag over the Kremlin was lowered for the last time, marking the end of an era. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was a seismic event in world history, effectively ending the Cold War and reshaping the global political landscape. The threat of direct military confrontation between the two superpowers, particularly nuclear war, receded dramatically. The world moved into a new, albeit still complex, era. While not a traditional flashpoint of near conflict between the superpowers, the internal collapse of the Soviet Union was the ultimate resolution of the Cold War's tensions. It was the final act in a decades-long drama that had repeatedly brought the world to the brink of disaster. The end of the Soviet Union marked the end of the Cold War era and the beginning of a new, uncertain, but ultimately less directly confrontational period in international relations.